stories. We hear them when we visit with you, but we don't hear them often enough, and we don't hear the funny ones and the ones that have touched your life so often, and we want to hear those, and that's why we wanted to start this, so that we would have opportunity ourselves to hear your stories, but that you would have opportunity to hear each other's stories and to get to know each other better. And I bet you money that you'll come out of here today saying, I didn't know that about him or her. Or I have something in common with this person that I didn't realize. Or that person was really funny. Or whatever. There's going to be something you're going to learn about each person today. So when everybody gets settled, we're going to start, but we're going to wait and let everybody get settled. All right, well, let me introduce our first person. Our first person is Ann Lawson. Ann's been here about 7 years, 5 years from Smithfield, and many of you know Ann well. She lives in East Apartments, and she has a story to tell, so come on up, Ann. I want to get the microphone adjusted just right. I think that's a good for you right there.
You say so.
Now, can you speak and see if they can hear you? Say good
Can
afternoon.
you hear me now?
I'm going to sit on the back and I'm going to wave at you if I can't hear you.
I'm going to wave at me if you can.
Okay.
It was January the 27th, 1923. Katie Tall Beckton, age 40, had just closed the bedroom door after telling her 10-year-old son good night. She was getting ready to sit in her favorite chair and read a while. She was a very contented mother and housewife. Her only sadness was pangs of regret she often felt over not having another child. She had one infant to be stillborn and another that lived a few hours. She would very much like to have a little sister, a Willow. The telephone rang, and answering it, she heard her friend and distant relative, Jessie Kennedy, tell her that she was going to Fayetteville the next day. She told her that a half-brother, John Kennedy, had called with his wife, Maddie, had died in childbirth, and had left a 2-year-old girl and a 10-day infant, and wanted Jessie to come and get them. Katie asked how in the world could she manage. Jessie told her she'd engaged a colored woman named Cora to go with her on the train and to help her out in Kinston for as long as she needed her. Katie said, Jessie, just a minute. Let me go ask Mr. Beckton if we can't help you with that baby. Katie never called her husband anything other than Mr. Beckton. When she first knew him, she was only 12, and he was 22. She called him Mr. Beckton, and she never changed her habit. Mr. Beckton, age 50, was home with the flu and was in bed. Katie burst into the bedroom with the question, Mr. Beckton, John Kennedy's wife has died, and Jessie's going to Fayetteville tomorrow to get a 2-year-old and the infant. Can't we keep the infant? And he didn't answer. And it was several moments, and she said, Mr. Beckton, Jessie's waiting on the telephone. And he said, well, this can't be a snap decision. So after a few more minutes, he did say that if John agreed for the baby to be adopted, she could come. She said, Mr. Beckton, his wife has died. We can't ask him that now. He said, well, then he can't bring the baby here because we get so attached and we'd have to give it up. She thought on the way back to the phone, couldn't she doctor that a little bit? Couldn't she say, we'd love to have him. But then she realized he was right. If they had to give it up, it would be heartbreaking. Jessie seemed very relieved with the idea of the Becktons taking the baby. Jessie was unmarried, worked, and knew nothing about children, especially babies. She assumed responsibilities quickly and felt with the help of the responsible black lady, she could manage the 2-year-old easily. After all, she didn't think it would be but for a few weeks. Katie and Ed got very little sleep that night. They were excited and fearful at the same time. They were excited about possibly finally getting a little girl and a sister for Wilbur. Katie was thinking, where would she put the baby? And what would she feed him? She had disposed of Wilbur's crib when the last baby died. She wondered what sort of milk she would feed it. And Ed, on the other hand, prayed that Katie would not be disappointed again. He had seen her heart broken twice, and he did not want her to go through it a third time. He prayed that John would agree for them to adopt her. When morning came, they decided not to tell Wilbur about the possibility of him having a sister, but to give him his breakfast and send him off to school as usual. Meanwhile, Jessie and Cora traveled by train to Fayetteville and went to the home of Miss Alice Davis. She had been like a mother to Mattie Jackson, taking her after she was left motherless in childbirth. John had taken the two little girls out when Mattie's temperature rose so high in the hospital. Many people were there, including the girl's grandfather, Robert Jackson. They were all so sad at Mattie's death, and also upset at the children having to leave home. They and Alice was not strong enough to care for them. John had not learned to love the baby. In fact, it hurt for him to even look at her. He readily agreed to the adoption idea. He knew Katie and Ed. He'd been reared in the Methodist orphanage and worked for several summers on the Tuttle farm, which belonged to Katie's sister. The Becktons had him to spend the weekend in town whenever he so chose. He remembered all that a new baby required and was overwhelmed with the idea of rearing one by himself. Getting up Alice was much harder. He and Mattie had a daughter and had hoped that having another baby wouldn't be too upsetting for her. A few weeks prior to the new baby's coming, John had given her a little white Eskimo Spitz for her very own. When Jessie prepared to leave after eating a hurried meal with many grieving neighbors, she decided to take the dog to Kinston also. She felt if Alice had lost her mother, was leaving her daddy, and going home with a perfect stranger, she wouldn't make her give up the dog too. The tearful goodbyes were said at the Davis home, and a neighbor drove them to the station. When they reached the train station, the conductor told Jessie that dogs were not allowed in the passenger car. She said, well, where did they ride? In the baggage car. So Jessie said, well, we'll ride the baggage car too. So she took Alice by the hand. Cora had Ann in the basket. She had the baby in the basket. And the dog was in a box. They sat on the box, and Alice played occasionally with the dog, and the baby slept the sleep of a newborn. It was dark when they arrived in Kinston. They came straight to the Becktons, and of course Ed and Katie were overcome with joy. Will was surprised and very proud to have a little sister. The next morning, when someone asked him what he thought of his new sister, he answered, I didn't know she was going to cry all night. After Mattie had developed such a high fever and had to be hospitalized, the baby had to be put on a bottle. They gave her whole milk, and she had a tummy ache. Katie knew instinctively to give her skim milk, and in just a few days, she was very comfortable. The name Gwendolyn Mattie Kennedy had been given to the baby, and Katie and Ed felt with the addition of Becton, that would be a little much. They decided on the name Ann Kennedy Becton. Due to the excitement of the family addition, Katie and Ed forgot that their sister-in-law, Valerie Becton, was making her annual stopover visit in Kinston en route from Rutherford, New Jersey to Miami. She always stayed in Hotel Kinston and had meals with the Bectons in town and those in the country. She was so surprised and touched that Katie and Ed would take a baby permanently that she went on a shopping spree. She had the furniture store deliver that day a large crib with screening called a kitty cook, a high chair, a carriage, and a potty chair. She brought with her when she came to Durham carriage robes, sacks, caps, dresses, and diapers. All the clothes supplemented what was sent from Fayetteville, so the Butlins had nothing to purchase. Katie easily settled into a schedule a new baby demanded. She was completely happy. Ed was pleased and happy, but he had a nagging worry. Weeks passed, months passed, no word from John Kennedy. Jesse and Alice received cards from Florida, where he'd gone to get away. Each card ended with, "I'll see you soon." Ed knew until John came to Kinston and signed adoption papers. Ann still belonged to him. When Ann was 10 years old, Daddy, Ed Button, took her to the courthouse and set her up on the register of deeds counter. "I want to show you my best transaction," he said. Ann thought, what could be so great? She knew her father sold real estate, and how could one deed be more important than another? He asked for a certain book of deeds, she thought, and turned the pages. She read where he designated on a certain day in August 1923, John Kennedy signed the adoption papers, making Ann legally belong to Katie and Ed. When Ann looked up at her dad, he had tears in his eyes. This made quite an impression, and Ann realized that of all his transactions, he considered her adoption the most important. She felt very loved and never forgot that day and the way her father showed her what her adoption meant to him. In 1948, Ann was 25 years old and happily married to Herman Lawson, a wonderful devoted husband with whom she had a fine 4-year-old son and a newly adopted little girl. She relived that visit to the Register of Deeds office with her dad. In North Carolina, when you adopt a child, there's a 6-month wait before the courts will allow the end of the adoption process. There are visits and inspections made to be sure the child is properly cared for. During this period, Ann realized how anxious her parents must have been for John Kennedy to come and sign the legal papers. It was singular that they had a 6-month wait, as her husband had, before they could be positive that little girl would not be taken away. When Herman and Ann were cleared for the final signing, they were so thankful and thrilled that their darling little girl was really, truly theirs forever. Their son meant so much to them, and Ann's gifted little sister made their family complete. Ann Betson Lawson truly understood what her dad meant by his best transaction ever.
Say a word and see if they can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. From 1958 until 1968, my first husband and I were medical missionaries in Nigeria, West Africa. His name was Connell Smith, and he had completed his residency in general and thoracic surgery at Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Meanwhile, I've been in the School of Medical Technology. Our first trip to Nigeria, we went with our 2 children, ages 6 and 4, on a British freighter. It only could take 13 passengers, and we were on the ocean for 26 days. I can assure you that was not the Queen Mary. My children learned a lot, as curious as they were about the workings of a ship. And the British soldiers were very kind and gracious to them, played games with them, and helped pass the time away, and gave us a little free time. We were stationed in Bomsho, Nigeria, a town of 250,000 people, but a very bush town. No stores except the little kiosks they had here and there that did not have the groceries we would most need, so we had to go 65 miles away to buy groceries. Baptists have a 100-bed hospital in Awamishaw, and at the other end of the compound, there is a Baptist theological seminary where young men are trained to be preachers and ministers in the churches. The hospital had a wonderful reputation and served not only Nigerians, but also Peace Corps workers, Gulf Hall workers, embassy people, and USAID people. There were usually 3 missionary doctors on staff, and 3 or 4 missionary nurses. Connell was the only thoracic surgeon in Nigeria when we arrived there. On a normal day, 3 or 4 surgeries were done in the morning, and in the afternoon, at least 200 patients came to clinic from the surrounding town and villages. There were also 250 missionaries in Nigeria at that time, many of them educators, agricultural people, and they all depended on the hospital for their routine medical care and also their emergencies. I helped at the lab in the hospital. They had trained Nigerian lab technicians, but I often went and helped with special things that needed to be done. But most of all, I taught our 3 children using a Calvert course out of Baltimore, Maryland. And I served as the station hostess because there were no restaurants and no motels in town. And so when a family would come to the hospital for medical care, I would get a call telling me how many we would have for dinner that night or who would be in our guest room overnight. So it could be quite a challenge. In 1968, things began to change as conflict between the eastern region of Nigeria and the north and the west became dangerous for us. The east, rich with oil, threatened to break away from the rest of Nigeria and call itself Biafra. The military presence was everywhere. As we traveled, we had to pass through roadblocks and have our cars inspected, and sometimes our persons. It was amazing to us that people in a third world country knew so much about what was going on here in the States in the 60s. They knew about Mississippi. They knew about John Kennedy's death and came to salute us because we had lost our president. We could tell from their conversations that they were discussing among themselves, although they were speaking in Yoruba. They were talking about things going on here in the States, and we were often embarrassed and found it difficult to explain what was happening. I had a dental appointment in a city 65 miles away one morning and was stopped at a roadblock. 2 soldiers with guns approached the car and one said, "I have heard what has happened in your country today." And I realized that over BBC radio that morning, we had learned about the death of Martin Luther King. I expressed my regret and my great sorrow as best I could. He had me get out of the car and open the trunk and to inspect it. All the while I was aware that the barrel of his gun was very close by. Then he asked, "What brought you to my country?" When I told him about the work in the Obamashal Hospital, his countenance immediately changed, and he said, "It's okay, you can go." On May the 16th, we were traveling from Lagos, the capital city at that time, to Obamashal when a military Land Rover full of soldiers ran us off the road and crashed into our car, killing my husband and seriously injuring me. We learned later that marijuana had been found on the soldiers. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks with a fractured pelvis, a dislocated arm, and many cuts and abrasions. Our missionary friends, along with our 3 children, made arrangements to bury Connell on the hospital compound next to the nurses' chapel. My mother and Connell's brother came to Nigeria to be with us. Connell's funeral was held in a large church in town, where I was told 2,400 people crowded into the church and at least 1,000 stood on the outside. Boy Scouts and school children lined the streets from the church to the burial site. Television cameras and press people were there. The fact that I could not be present with the children at this service added to my grief. Our wonderful missionary family and Nigerian friends ministered to us in so many ways. After happy and rewarding years in Nigeria, 1968 was not a good year for us. I was offered a position at the Foreign Mission Board in Richmond, Virginia, and in August, the children, my mother, and I returned to the States. Working in the Africa office gave me an opportunity to keep in touch with Nigeria, for which I was most grateful.
Thank you very much, Eunice. That's not an easy story to tell, but we like hearing that part of your life. Incidentally, I first heard of Eunice when I worked at that same Foreign Mission Board in Richmond before I came to work at Springmore. And at that point, she had met and married Tom Bland, so had moved on to another portion of her life. Thank you again so much for telling us that story. Our next person coming is Marshall Evans. Marshall Evans is a resident who's been here about 2 years and lives in East Apartments with his wife Frances. And I don't know how much he's going to tell about this, but Marshall, together with Judd Ammons, developed Springmore. Some of you may not know that. So I invite Marshall to come and tell what he will.
First of all, I didn't expect this kind of crowd. I thought we were going to be speaking to a video camera. So this is a little different. The other thing that's different about my talk today is each of the other people have a story to tell. I was assigned a story to tell. There are certain, many countless advantages being a good friend with Phyllis Mayo, who's been a friend of our family for many years. And then there are disadvantages. Maybe she knows too much, feel free, she can assign topics. In order to make some sense of my topic, the topic assigned to me is burning the candle at both ends. I'll have to tell you a little about my background and how this builds up to the conclusion. My long-term career was with the Public Health Service. I was selected in 1966 to come to North Carolina to establish an office for the National Center for Health Statistics. As we did that, we developed the office, developed a staff of about 135 people. The routine mission was in data collection, processing, and preparing medical-related data for research purposes. During that process, I became interested in how they handle research information on causes of death. The traditional way had been to have people who are called nosologists, who are specialists in classification of disease, code the underlying cause of death, that is, the medical condition that created the sequence of events resulting in death. I reasoned that we ought to be able to automate this and use the computer to do that process. No one thought it could be done, most of all the nosologists. So we set out to do that. Very tedious work. The work involved countless hours in establishing relationship of diseases, causal relationships, sequels of diseases, and so on. In the midst of all of that, and we eventually succeeded, by the way, and the system was accepted, proven, tested, and is now used worldwide. It also provided us avenue to further exploit data from death certificates, so we could get information for researchers on the interrelationship of diseases and all kinds of things. The net process of all of this was we gradually succeeded through attrition in reducing that staff from 135 to 31. And in the process, we were getting better data, higher quality, more efficiency, and so on. Well, all of that was very tedious, lots of work, burning the candle a great deal beyond the regular hours. Along at that time, Judd Ammons approached me and says, "What do you know about these life care communities?" It was one day after church. And I said, "Well, I know a good deal about them." He said, "You reckon I could build one?" I said, "I'm sure you could if you wanted to." He said, "You reckon you could run one?" I said, "I'm sure I could if I wanted to." And we went away. A couple of weeks later, he called me and said, "I've got two people who say they're the world's foremost experts in life care communities. Come, let's talk to them." Well, these were two people who were associated with a would-be community that was going to be built on Newton Road called the Avalon. And one was an architect and the other was an administrative type. We worked with them a short while and decided that we didn't have things in common. And the lady, incidentally, was certain that we would fail in the idea of building a life care community unless she was very, very much involved. I guess she was wrong. Well, then here we were. We formed a partnership. Judd, Mason Williams, Joellen, his wife, and myself. Judd and Mason were going to be primarily responsible for the architecture and the building and all that. I was supposed to take the blank piece of paper and make an administrative organization happen. So needless to say, there was countless information, countless work there. Building a staff, building budgets, planning space, being involved in how this place would be constructed and what areas and so on. Burning the candle at both ends. I was literally then working about 16, 18 hours a day. Because all the while I'm still working at the Triangle on the projects there, which I very much wanted to bring to conclusion. Well, in the midst of all of this pressure, burning the candle, a friend of ours came over to Chapel Hill to the medical facilities there, Dr. Peter Hamill, and he called and wanted to know if we would have dinner with him at the Angus Barn. And I thought, oh, I'm so tired, I don't know if I can go out and spend the evening at the Angus Barn or not. So we went. It's the only time in my life I've ever had an appetizer at the Angus Barn. They have so much food, you just don't get appetizers. We had an appetizer. Then he wanted to discuss wine. Dr. Hamill is the only person I've known personally who had a bona fide wine cellar, controlled with humidity, temperature, the works. Bottles this way, up in Annapolis, Maryland. So he was ready to discuss the wine in great detail and proceeded to start until I said, "Look, Peter, the most I know about wine is something called Manischewitz." And he looked at me a little aghast and decided he should order the wine. Well, keep in mind now, I'm tired as can be, just didn't want to be there. Well, he ordered some type of wine that has to age, you stir it, you flip it around, you wait a while before you drink. Meanwhile, we had the other kinds of food. We had all they served. Came time for desserts, and I'm almost in prayer saying, no desserts, please, no desserts. My wife said, oh, I'll have. Well, at this point, I thought, I'll just excuse myself and go to the men's room and wash my face, and that'll freshen me up a bit. I washed my face, and then I made the serious mistake of looking over at the commode, and it was the most comfortable looking chair I've ever seen in my life. So I sat down there just a moment, and then I looked at the roll of toilet paper. I've never seen a more comfortable looking pillow. So I thought, I'll just lean my head here just for a moment. Of course, I went promptly to sleep, slept a long time. Meanwhile, Peter's asking my wife, Dr. Hamill's asking my wife, where's Marshall? Do you suppose anything's wrong and all of this? Finally, Francis says, he's somewhere asleep, but he'll be back. So, in due time, I awakened. And I got having a look in the mirror, and where I'd leaned my head over the toilet paper, the metal rim had put a big crease in my forehead. So I said, no problem, I'll wipe it off. So I wiped and wiped. Then I had a ridge in my forehead with a red blotch around it. With that, I went back to our table, to a very, very unhappy wife, and to a Dr. Hamill, who then lectured me the remainder of the evening. Marshall, you're working too hard, you're burning the candle at both ends, you're doing nothing but killing yourself, and I've enjoyed telling this story for Phyllis.
Thank you, Marshall. That is my favorite Marshall Evans story. I've heard it many times, and I'll never get tired of hearing it. Isn't that a great story? Joyce is not a resident, but she is becoming more and more one of us. Joyce is the mother-in-law of Meg Barb Hunn, who is one of the priests at Christ Church. Anybody know Meg? Yes, there are a few of you in here who do. Meg called me. I love Meg. She's wonderful. And she called me one day. She said, I have the most wonderful mother-in-law. Well, that's a check, because how many people say I have a wonderful mother-in-law? But anyway, she said they just moved to town and she's wanting something to do. And she would love to come and meet you and perhaps volunteer at Springmore. And Beth and I were just at the point of beginning this storytelling effort to know we needed somebody else. And Joyce came along, and she is our new friend. So Joyce is going to come tell a story. Joyce loves stories.
After you've heard these today, you see why I love stories. One thing leads to another. By the time we're this age, we know that, don't we? Sometimes one thing leads to a wonderful new thing. Sometimes one thing leads to trouble.
A little bit, not too much.
She talked to me too much about talking loud.
Okay, that's
Is that good? Is that better? All right. So I'm going to tell you, we have moved many, many, many times in our almost 50 years together, my husband and I. He's a mechanical engineer interested in energy things, and I'm a school teacher. So we've moved. I'm going to tell you about one of those moves. In must have been about 73, we moved to Los Alamos, New Mexico. We lived in upstate New York, where it snowed, in my opinion, all the time. In Los Alamos, New Mexico, it only snowed in the winter, but it was 8,000 feet in the air. So it was still very different from upstate New York. Well, one thing leads to another. We had 2 small children, put them in school. They love the canyons. They love to walk up and down and around and everywhere on those canyons. And I love to go with them. Well, we began to notice the petroglyphs there in the caves and on the rocks. And we began, as studiers like you, student-type folk, we began to learn more and more about the Anasazi, who had lived there many, many thousands of years before. We learned about them, we learned how they made the petroglyphs. We didn't know any more than anybody else did about what they meant. Well, that led to something else, and I started leading tours of kids to come and see the petroglyphs. Kids found many more petroglyphs than those adults ever found. And then I started taking pictures of them and found out that the museum in Santa Fe wanted some of those pictures. That was fun. Well, now there was a lot of these areas that had not been photographed, found, or looked at for a very long time. And why? Because Los Alamos, New Mexico had been closed to anybody, totally closed. You could not go up that hill and go in those gates because a very secret thing had been happening there for many, many years. By the time we moved there, that was still history. But in 39, 40, 41, Los Alamos was chosen because it was hard to get to. Fermi and others were beginning to discover fusion. If you smash that atom in a certain way, whoa, look at the energy you can get. Everybody knew that all around the world, but as the fear of war began to grow across the world, people began to think maybe we could use some of this to end some of these conflicts, and we better do it first. So the folks from Oak Ridge, the folks from Chicago, the folks from out in Washington State began to gather together, and they were gathered by a man who had done a lot of hiking up there in those mountains long and long ago. He got them together in Los Alamos. There were just a few of them, no families, secret place, box 1663 in Santa Fe. The families of these scientists didn't even know where they were going. They sent things to box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. So this area had been closed off for many, many, many years then. But by the time we got there in the 70s, it had been open and families lived there as people do. One thing leads to another. They began to have families up there, do all kinds of other research. And the reason we showed up there was that now this place was beginning to do solar energy research, a whole new way to look at energy. Well, my job of running around with kids on the mountains and on the rocks eventually led to a real job. I was hired as an archivist there at the History Museum, not at the big Los Alamos National Museum, but at the small little History Museum that was housed in the only building still standing from the ranch school that had been there before the Los Alamos project was started, the Manhattan Project, named to throw people off, I guess, about where it was happening. So I started learning to do oral history. And there were all kinds of oral history projects already, from Fermi and Oppenheimer and Ray Bradbury, and the people that had actually been the formators of this project. But what about the folks that actually came there together to build the pieces, to build the little parts, to actually put them together to make this test bomb? Nobody ever really talked to them. I got to do that. I went down off of the hill, went around, sat and visited with them. They had no idea that they, too, had a story. They thought stories were just about important, wonderful people. Well, they were important, wonderful people. So today, I hope that each one of you has heard several wonderful stories and has begun to think about those wonderful stories where one thing has led to another in your life. Fill out that little paper we gave you. Talk to Phyllis. Talk to Beth. Let's have this wonderful time lead to another.
Recently, I completed the Springmore Library's workshop on life stories.
Barb, hold the mic closer.
Closer.
Yeah.
Unlike the other members of the course who wrote only stories about themselves, I wrote stories about myself as well, and stories shared with me by other ministers' wives of the 1950s and 1960s. The story I am reading today is a story about myself. But if you know of any ministers' wives out there who have stories and would like to share, I'd love to hear them. And if you filled out the form that floated around about today's gathering, my name goes with the chicken. I was what you would call a city slicker. I was a new minister's wife, and as such, found myself living in my very first parsonage. This was a new experience for me. New wife, new mother, living in a new state, town, and pretending to know what a pastor's wife was supposed to do. I had been raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a major northern city, and was now relocated to a small farming community in western North Carolina. I was used to a Macy's department store and now visited Bubba's Green and Hairdressing Establishment. The parsonage was located directly across the street from the church. Next to the church was a large, dilapidated, unpainted big old mansion owned by the oldest woman I had ever met or seen. Her name, truthfully, was Miss Daisy. There was only dirt around her house. There was no electricity, no indoor plumbing. One day, while my mother, also from Philadelphia, was visiting me, I heard a knock on the door. I hurried to open it, as any responsible and knowing pastor's wife would do. Greeting me on the porch was a man I had never seen. With dirty baseball cap in hand, overalls, not having seen a drop of wash water in many a week, boots covered with the red mud of the area, a cheek full of tobacco, but with the sweetest smile around those parts, he introduced himself as a friend of Miss Daisy's. He informed me that Ms. Daisy would like to give me a chicken. Would I be interested? Anyone who has any knowledge of the clergy knows that ministers are not paid very much, especially as they start out in their chosen profession. To be offered a chicken was like being offered a bar of gold. I, of course, expressed my sincere appreciation for the offer and thoughtfulness, and the gentleman, term loosely used, said that he would return with the chicken in about 15 to 20 minutes. I thanked him and closed the door. I hurried back to the kitchen to share the great news with my mother, who was hiding behind the kitchen door, listening to the conversation and offer of a welcome meal. She said that this gift of a chicken would take the concern from what we would have for dinner that night. About 20 minutes went by, and there was another knock. I pushed the hair back from my face, wiped my hands on my apron, and opened the door. Before me were two hands. Well, one held a smoking shotgun. The other held a headless chicken. I know there was more to the hands than that, like a full body with legs and head, but all I saw were two hands. Since I had never seen a chicken that was not cleaned and wrapped in cellophane, I was taken aback. But without losing a beat, I was the ever-gracious pastor's wife and held out my hand to accept the still warm but not moving chicken. Even as we transferred the bird from his hand to mine, bits of corn that the chicken had just eaten fell out of the neck and onto the living room floor. Once the door was closed and my new friend was gone, I just stood there in the living room, unable to move one foot in front of the other. Finally, my mother came from the kitchen asking me, where's the chicken? Where's the chicken? When I turned around for her to see, she quickly said, hurry, we can bury it in the backyard. For a few seconds, I considered her suggestion. Then I realized that women around the world were in their kitchens doing something to their birds that would enable them to prepare dinner. I must do the same. So with my mother's constant wonderment and her daughter's new role as a minister's wife, I consulted the one and only cookbook I had and quickly learned how to really be a pastor's partner and clean, cut, and cooked my very first chicken.
Barb, I love that story. Thank you so much for coming today. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you've thought, oh, I have a story to tell too. Fill out your little cards, if you will. I hope everybody got one. And you can just, why don't you just leave them in your seats when you get up, rather than trying to collect them. Yes, you can. Yes, yeah. Be sure and do that, okay? Thank you so much for coming. Take time to fill out your cards, if you will, and let's say thank you once again to all our storytellers. And put July 24th on your calendars.
I'm supposed to.